it's interesting. Everyone knows they're going to die. Like everyone does factually know they're going to die. And it's like knowing two things as being equally true. You 100% know you're going to die, and you 100% know you're never going to die. Like you factually know you're going to die, but actually recognizing yourself as no longer existing is like unbelievable. Like you can't really, most people can't wrap their heads around that. So you know two things as being true, but only one of them is true. And depending on where you are in life, where these two truths kind of like rub against each other is kind of an interesting idea. So I'm about to turn 50. I'll turn 50 this summer. And I really only started to like wrap my head around the idea that I actually, of course, I've known I'm going to die ever since you understand what death is as a little kid, but really understanding that I actually wasn't going to be around, I didn't really start wrapping my head psychologically around that until I was in like my mid-ish 40s. And I went through a very difficult series of events where I was like, oh crap, I'm going to die. Like at some point I'm going to die. And that could be 2 days from now, or it could be like 50 years from now. So it's no wonder that people don't talk about death from a like first person perspective. They talk about death, but they don't talk about their death or want to plan about it. And I don't even know if it's from an avoidance point of view, but more so from it's like, it's inconceivable that I won't exist anymore, even though I actually know I won't exist.
It's interesting, there's always that underlying stress. And what happens and what you're experiencing is you're starting to measure your life from the end instead of from the beginning.
Mm.
And what that means is that we are starting to acknowledge our mortality and seeing things as, a little bit more limited, and that reality is becoming more clear. It's a gift when we do this, and there's a piece in the middle of our life where we just don't acknowledge it, but it's a nice gift because once you start to acknowledge that you're mortal and you start measuring from the end, the things that don't matter can fall away much easier. You get rid of a lot of things in your life that just don't matter. And I think that's the blessing that comes from acknowledging our mortality. And I really wish that people would be able to see that the sooner they do that, the sooner they can improve the quality of their life overall and reduce that stress that they've got, because it's always in the back of our minds.
Yeah, we know that like people could be not talking about death and not planning for death and not being in a kind of a death preparedness state of mind, maybe because of avoidance and like anxiety, fear, and all that, but also just like from without any ability to really wrap your mind around that you're going to die. You know it, but you just can't actually take that in. And not even from an avoidance point of view, you just can't think of it. It's almost like, the number 1 million exists, but if I asked you to like imagine what 1 million rubber duckies look like, you just couldn't do it. Like you just couldn't wrap your head around it. So when you are working with clients, like how do you manage those two states? Like some are like anxiety avoidance, fear avoidance, talking about death, where others are just like, I literally can't wrap my mind around it.
That's a really interesting question, because when I first started my business, that was the roadblock that I kept hitting. Is I wanted people, because I was ready to do the pre-planning end of things and knew people needed it, trying to convince people they needed it, and they weren't there yet. There generally has to be some sort of catalyzing event to get people ready to talk about it and to be that personal and specific. So what I learned was to pull back and talk and think about death from a perspective of philosophy and theoretical. So when we approach it softly from that theoretical and philosophical point of view, and we invite it into our lives in a little bit more gentle way without it being so personal, then we can start to build that relationship with our mortality from a safer place. And I think that's something that I've learned over the years is let's start with the theoretical and the philosophical, and then we can work up to, now how does that apply to me personally?
This whole topic is fascinating to me because like around end of life preparedness, I had a friend in the past few years, like a real good friend of mine, who had a family member that they weren't close with, who had passed away and was prepared and had left quite a large sum of money to be distributed across the family. And they were prepared, knew in advance they're going to go, kind of had a sense of how long I've got left to live. their mental faculties had declined as they got closer. And when they passed away, there was like pretty like strong instructions, and it was still a complete shit show. Like after they passed, it's like people's like, this person's trying to steal money and this, and like the family devolved into like just battle. And a friend of mine was telling me about it, who was relatively detached from the whole thing because they weren't close with that family member and weren't close with the rest of the family, but they themselves, without intending to, was going to benefit largely. They're going to get quite a large sum of money. And they were like, oh my God, I feel like I've suddenly got like 20 enemies that I'm sort of distantly related to. So that's like someone who had really planned for their death and knew well in advance. I can't imagine what happens if people don't have that.
Well, I always tell people when I'm talking about planning for end of life, is like, we're weird about death and we're weird about money. And when you put death and money together, the weirdness expands exponentially. And what you think is a loving, caring bunch of people is going to devolve. Or you get the other way, where you have a family that's not close and this can bring them together. Every situation is different. With the lack of a will and with the lack of a plan, and even more importantly, doesn't matter whether you have a will or not, or a valid will or not, because some people have wills that aren't valid. The most important thing and the most critical piece is communication and transparency. So whether you have a will or not, letting your wishes be known is going to mitigate some of that stress that people have, whether they have a will or not. Like, get it out in the open, talk about it, share the will, talk about what your final wishes are for your end of life care and for distribution of your assets, and all those kinds of things. And that's going to help mitigate some of that, because what's happening is people are going through a big change, and they get all the feels, right? They've got all the feelings and they don't know what to do with it. And so when we talk about it, it gives people to integrate that change a little bit easier and a little bit sooner, so that when the event occurs, things don't get quite as weird sometimes.
So if someone's preparing for death, like what's the role of, okay, so let's say you go to a lawyer, you get a will, but like what does an executor do, and is it necessary? Like, or is that just like, if you get a will, do you automatically have an executor, or do you have to do something in advance? Like, what do you do here?
So the executor is kind of like your death power of attorney. So in life, you have a power of attorney. So generally when you fill out a will, you fill out a power of attorney. The person is responsible for your finances and your assets when you're alive. An executor does the same role. They are responsible for distributing your assets and closing out your life after you die. So they're the ones that are legally and financially responsible for your financial footprint on the earth after you leave, financial and your digital footprint once you leave this plane of existence. So their role is to follow your wishes to the best of their ability and to the best of your estate's ability. So they're distributing your assets, closing out your life, shutting down your Facebook and Instagram account, erasing your browser history. That's the role of an executor, is to make sure that your assets are taken care of in your life, your debts, your taxes, all that kind of stuff is taken care of.
Mike, I promise I'll erase your browser history.
Thank you. I've done it.
I'll do that for you, man.
I've told many friends I would do it.
I'll do that for you. So what is a death doula?
A death doula is an advocate for the dying. So it is a death doula is someone who takes care of the physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being of someone who is actively in the process of dying. So more heart-centered care than, say, what I do, which is more death project management, paperwork, and legal and taxation type stuff. Their role is to be that voice for the dying, to be that bridge between professionals and family, and be the voice for the dying and help the dying manage the passage with a little bit more peace and kindness.
Yeah, so you exactly where went to where I was gonna go. It's like, okay, this is what an executor does. This is what a death doula does. So I love how you explain it. And when Monica shared the brief from your conversation, it was like, Oh, a death project manager. Like, that makes a lot of sense. So could you explain your services and really explain that aspect of it?
All right. So as a death educator, what I do is I run workshops and educational sessions, whether they're presentations, lunch and learns, or workshops, to small groups of individuals to talk about various aspects of either planning for end of life or planning for executorship. I sort of informally refer to it as life hacking and then death hacking. So figuring out what to do while you're still here and then figuring out what to do after. So the workshops are generally 2 hours in length, and we do really practical stuff. So it's about learning what you need to know to make really good, well-informed decisions about what you need to do, whether it's for your advanced care plan and your personal directive, whether it's for your will and preparing to write your will or to discuss your will or have those important conversations with your family, whether you're trying to choose an executor and you are not sure who would be a right fit for the job because it is a big job, and has a lot of legal responsibility associated with it that most people don't realize. Whether you are an executor and you don't know what to do now that you've got the title and the role, I'm there to help. So, those kinds of things. Anything related to the change that comes with death, I can take care of and help inform people about those items. One of my most favorite workshops to facilitate, and is also very popular, is body, organ, and tissue donation, and how those particular aspects of end of life intersect. How you can make sure that your wishes are known, what order do you have to do them in, what paperwork do you have to fill in, what considerations do you have to think about when you're thinking about whether you want to be an anatomical gift or whether you want to donate all your bits and pieces, whether it's to science or to someone who needs them.